Welcome back, everyone. My name is Father Christopher Bashirs. I'm pastor of the Panhandle out here in Oklahoma. And we are now in our fourth video on the general instruction of the Roman Missal. If you haven't already gotten into the general instruction, this is not maybe the best place to pick up. If you want, we've got a playlist down here on our YouTube channel that you can go back and watch the videos from first all the way to this one. That's how I would suggest it, but you're most welcome anyhow. Also, if you haven't already done the readings in preparation, that's not the end of the world, but I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you actually go and read the documents of the church. And you can find that in the link below, that we have linked to a free version of it online. You don't have to buy a book of it. The Vatican provides a great resource for you right there. So let's go ahead and get started here. And we'll pick up right where we left off with 299. Now, 299 in there states the altar built apart from the wall, allowing for the Mass of facing the people. Altar should be at the center. Now, I want to explain something for a bit because there seems to be a little problem of translation here. In the actual 299, it quotes and says, "It is desirable that there be for the facing of the people," the Mass allowing for the Mass of the facing the people. It is desirable. Well, there's a problem here, and I'll reference an axiom by St. Jerome, who was translating all the scriptures into Latin, and he said every translator is a traitor, and he knew this because not everything translates directly. So, but we have a little bit of a problem here. So I went back to the only official version of this document, which is in Latin. So any others are just translations, and they're not official. So I wanted to go back and I wanted to verify here because I'd never heard this before, that it was desirable, this intention that it was desirable for this to happen. So when we're talking about documents, and we go back to the very first video about authority and with what authority this document speak, we have to go back to the Latin to look at it. Now, we won't get into a whole big, huge Latin lesson here, but suffice it to say that the word in Latin is expedient. Which we get the word expedient from. We see that almost directly. But this doesn't mean desirable. We more closely see a better translation up in 298, which we just read at the end of the last video, which it's translated as, "It is appropriate to have a fixed altar." So we might say that it is appropriate to have this so that it allows for the Mass facing the people. The Latin word itself, expedis, it means to kind of unhinder, unshackled, to allow for, to give a freedom for such practice, but it doesn't show a preference for, it doesn't show a desire for something. It's a very kind of interesting word because it means from, ex means out of, and then pedis is for feet. So it means like to unshackle the feet to free the feet so that they can move about. So it's saying that there's an allowance for this, a permission for it, and that this should be respected. There should be in the church also the permission to have a Mass facing the people. Although, as we've talked about in here, the general instruction of the Roman Missal, as well as the Missal itself, uses much language that shows that the intention of the church says that the common way of doing Mass is the ad orientem and not versus populum. But one of these key factors that I want to zoom in on right there is that the altar should be in the center. Some churches have tried to create an equal balance because they say the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist are equal. They're not equal. They are two parts of the Mass, but that doesn't mean they're equal parts of the Mass. The presence of Jesus Christ is much greater than His Word is. So in that, we need to have a proper context, and the Church says very strongly that the altar should be in the center, the focus for people. Now, dedicated altars should be done according to the Roman Pontifical, which is a book of rituals that the Church has for certain blessings and things like that. If it's movable, then it can just be blessed. Otherwise, you can dedicate it. Let's see. Altars should be made of natural natural stone. And in the U.S., we get an exception. They say it can be from worthy wood, as long as it's solid and well crafted. The support itself, just as long as it's worthy and solid, that's all that's required of it. Now, 302, Relics of Saints, it's venerable, it's wonderful practice to put them in the altar or underneath the altar, even if they're not of martyrs, which I think is a beautiful way to say that, because there shows a preference then, a real desire that there be a martyr in each church, at least a part, a bone, a fragment, a relic of a martyr in each church, and even will allow other saints. It's kind of like this notion here. It says it's best if you have a martyr, but we'll take saints as well. None of them are bad, but it shows of real importance and for that reverence. Single altar is preferable. If there's an old altar that is difficult to use, then they should have a new one. And in which case you wouldn't decorate the old one. Now I put in there as an example, that exempli gratis, a free example there is distance. So over in Rome, there's a lot of these old churches where they have the altar is way, 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 way back away from the people. And they even have, the monks' choir stalls there, all this space. And so, you are sitting there and you are, half a basketball court away from the altar before you start where the people are sitting. So there's a lot of those altars where it's difficult then for the people to really kind of be possibly close to it or to be closer to it. So we see this real intentionality of this this drawing near. They really want people not to be so separated from, as if they are disconnected. 304, there should be a white cloth covering the altar. In the U.S., again, exceptions, said there may be some other cloths that you use. For instance, you might have a green altar cloth for ordinary time. And so if you're going to have other cloths, then at least the mensa, that top part, just the top part of it, the flat part, the face of it has to be covered with a white cloth. Moderation in decorating the altar. When we talk about decorating the altars, it's not that they should be gaudy. The focus is Jesus Christ. The focus is the Eucharist. So there has to be some moderation there. Now, during Advent, you have great moderation because there really shouldn't be this kind of premature joy of Christmas. It's that idea that we celebrate all of Advent in a semi-penitential way, similar to Lent, not Lent, but similar in that moment as we are preparing for the coming of the Lord. And that we shouldn't overly excite that too early. So just kind of like how in the U.S. people celebrate Christmas too early. Well, they shouldn't. They should wait. They should really celebrate it on the day. For Lent, there's no flowers. Flowers are not permitted. So this is one reason why you might hear that people say weddings are not permitted during Lent. Well, no, we can have weddings at certain times during Lent. Other times we cannot. But we can have weddings during Lent, but we can't have flowers to decorate it. So sometimes brides don't like that because they say, well, I want to have 100,000 flowers. Well, we can't have them during Lent. It's really, again, that what is the mood? What is that feeling of Lent? We shouldn't be celebrating, having these kind of grand, outlandish celebrations and this expansiveness during those times. Now, during Laetare Sunday, solemnities and feasts, these are exceptions. So Laetare Sunday is during Lent, and during that day, when we wear robes, during solemnities and feasts, those are exceptions, in which you can have some. But again, during Lent, you shouldn't have, or even Advent itself, you shouldn't have just a great overabundance. Again, the celebration, the most important celebration is the one to come, both at the end of Advent with Christmas and at the end of Lent with Easter. So we shouldn't be outdoing those in any way, shape, or form. Floral decor should always be with moderation and not on the mensa, so not on the top of the altar. So it speaks about putting them around the altar maybe, but again, with moderation. We're not to kind of take away from what's happening at the altar. The altar is the focus. The Eucharistic celebration, the sacrificial offering, that is the center. Then on the mensa, until the gospel, and you will happily correct me and say, Father, that's not what we do here. And you're absolutely right. We're working on that. We're going to get to that point. But right now we are not keeping up with this, because until the gospel, you should only have on the mensa, on the top of the altar, the Evangeliary, the book of Gospels. And then afterwards, when you're doing the preparation of altar until the end of the purification, you will have the chalice, the paten, the ciborium, the purificator, the corporal, the pall, the microphone, the missal, and maybe a microphone. But it gives kind of, I put the asterisk there because it should only be used when necessary, when you need to hear, like in case the priest has a very subtle voice, a quiet voice, or the space is too large and his voice doesn't carry. In the smaller missions, I don't use a microphone for that very reason. God gave me a booming voice, and I don't need it all the time. Number 307, candles. They're required on or around the altar, around the mensa. So you don't have to have it, but it is, or you don't have to have them on the altar, but you have to have them at least around the altar as a requirement. Ex pedis, so we saw up there and above, we were talking about 299, and we heard the ex pedant. We see this ex pedis, to unshackle. But then we say this doesn't impede, this doesn't shackle then the view of the faithful. So when we talk about the candles being on the altar, it shouldn't shackle, shouldn't kind of do away with the freedom of the people to see the altar. But impede is a little bit of a different word in the sense that impede says anything might impede my vision. Well, it's not just impeding vision, but it's going back to interfere is the word that they use to translate it. But again, this is from that same root word, ex pedis and then impedis. That we're not trying to impedir, we're not trying to impede, meaning to shackle the view of the people, to close them out from seeing what's happening there. But the word they use is interfere. Well, anything might be considered interference with it if you have it up there. But that's not what the church intends. It's not even the word they use. 308, the cross should be on or near the altar and should remain even after the Mass. So you can have these processional crosses, but there really should be a crucifix somewhere in the sacred space, on or near the altar, for people to reflect upon, to people to draw near to that great, wonderful act of love that Jesus gave for us, so we might be free. So that is beautiful meditation, good meditation, laudable meditation. And so either it's on the altar or it's near the altar. 309, the dignity, I just quoted directly, the dignity of the ambo requires that only a minister of the word should go up to it. This is something also that we're going to work on here is because we sometimes have differences here. Even I noticed tonight in the ambo, we had a lot of different things that were kind of stuffed underneath there, and I've got to clean that out and say, no, the dignity of the ambo is for the word of God and not for all this extra stuff here. It's not just storage space. It's not something else. There is a real dignity here. So that only the minister of the word should go up to it, not anyone else. 310. Oh, which is why, let me back that up, which is why one reason we don't have people during Mass speaking from the ambo. We don't have Catholic Charities come up and speak at during our Mass from the ambo. Because again, going back to what the church has given us and outlined us for what we should be doing. 310, the celebrant chair is at the head of the sanctuary, unless the tabernacle is there. If the tabernacle is there, then Jesus Christ is at the head of the sanctuary. And I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, what they mean by head of the sanctuary, except for maybe the furthest point back. Now, the celebrant's chair should be at that head. But again, if Christ is there, then Christ takes precedence over anyone else. The seats should also be provided for the concelebrants or for choir dress priests. Now, I want to explain choir dress priests because it doesn't explain it there, and it may just assume that you know what that means. If the priests are there, but they're not concelebrating for one reason or another, for instance, our MCs, our priests in the archdiocese, and because they are doing another service, because they aren't able to dedicate themselves completely to the celebration of the Mass, then they are non-concelebrants. But they would also then come and they would be able to be in what's called choir dress and participate. If a priest had said too many Masses that day and was not able to concelebrate that Mass for limitation of Masses, then he would come in choir dress and sit there. And again, they would have a chance to receive the Eucharist in a special way, as we talked about in the last video. Also, goes on to say that the deacon must be near the celebrant. Doesn't say right next to, doesn't say to his left, to his right, but it does say near so that he can function properly as with the other ministers. There should always be a place for them that they can function properly. Places for the faithful to participate visually and spiritually. A very powerful way to say this. Not only should the people be able to see things, but they ought to be able to enter in spiritually. So it's not just that they have visually, so that we have over here in the parish hall that we just say, you know what, only, the ministers are going to be in the church and everyone else can be outside on a big screen. No, we want you to be there visually, but also spiritually, that you really have an engagement. So in this time of COVID, where a lot of people are visually participating, maybe from home or from other places, well, the problem is they also need to be spiritually present and participating fully actively. It's also expedient for benches or seats. Again, we see this word that goes back to 299. Not that it's desirable for benches or seats, but that it's expedient, that it's useful, that it would be. It's in a sense we ought to have that option available. It ought to be a provided option that you could put seats and benches in there. 312. The choir to be part of the faithful. So, they certainly have to have their own space in the sense that they are kind of, they need to be put all together. They need to have a way to be organized, but that they aren't separate from the faithful. They aren't, their own part. There isn't the sanctuary, the faithful, and the choir. No, the idea is that they're kind of together, which is why sometimes you see that they're up in choir lofts behind the people. But again, that's still a little bit of separation. So the idea is hopefully integration of that. And I think we do that pretty well here at Guyman. We do that well at Boise City. Beaver, maybe a little bit of work on. And Hooker, I think, done pretty well. It also allows them sacramental participation. So they shouldn't be in such a place where they can't receive the Eucharist. 313. Direct quote, organ or other lawfully approved musical instruments. So, the organ has pride of place in the Roman Rite. So that above all else should be encouraged. That is the goal. That is kind of the end of end game, is to have the organ if you're going to have instruments. And you can have other lawfully approved instruments, musical instruments. So it's not just that we can have any kind of instrument in there. So we need to be careful, because sometimes, people get kind of rambunctious and excited, like, oh my goodness, I was, at this concert and I heard this wonderful, xylophone. We should have a xylophone at Mass. Okay, well, hold on. We need to make sure that they are first lawfully approved, and then second of all, that they can be used for this dignity of the sacred space. We'll see that later on coming up, but we'll keep moving on. Advent in music, we should have moderation. It should be kind of toned down. We're not anticipating that joyfulness. We are toning it down a little bit. It's not necessarily penitential in its full aspect, but it should have reservedness, but hopefulness. We're getting ready for. Lent, that you should only have the music to support the singing. It really should serve no other purpose, and that's if you need it to support the singing. Now, there are exceptions for instance, Laetare Sunday, Gaudete Sunday. Gaudete is in Advent, Laetare is in Lent. And so for those 2 Sundays, you can have a little bit more of this kind of excitement, kind of a foretaste of that joy. Number 314, tabernacle is to be in a truly noble, prominent, readily visible, beautifully decorated, and suitable for a prayer place. It's a lot there. And they just want to show you the importance. They don't want to limit things too much or give too much to restrict it. But they also say, listen, y'all need to take care of the tabernacle. This is the very, we think back to the Ark of the Covenant and how important that was when it just held the tablets, the law of God. And if people touched it, they died. How much more important is the tabernacle of Jesus Christ? True presence of God there. So 315, tabernacle does not go on top of an altar, on top of the altar that is used for the Mass. Again, it's trying to draw this connection between what the theology is. On the altar happens the sacrifice. Well, if Jesus is already present in those hosts reserved in the tabernacle, then it's kind of saying that this sacrifice is going on at the same time it's already happened. So we're trying to create a good meditation for people's spiritual lives and draw out some of those differences. The bishop can decide whether it's either in the sanctuary or in a suitable chapel. So it's not necessarily up to the priests to make their own decisions on these things, but that the bishop really needs to weigh in and say, you know what, I want all of them in the sanctuary, or I want all of them in the suitable chapel, or I want a little mix, both. This place works better than that. This especially comes into play whenever there's renovations happening of the sanctuary. Now, there should be a special lamp, and here it's allowed to have oil or wax. So you can have this liquid oil, or you can even have what's kind of called liquid wax. It's really just oil, or having beeswax candles with it. Now, either is permissible, but just with that, I want to add a little side note that the USCCB has never permitted oil to be at the altar candles. So sometimes you see this, sometimes they say, oh, well, it's easier this way, or it's more cost efficient this way, or whatever. The Bishops' Conference has never permitted it. So it's never an option, never allowed to have oil at the altar candles. They are only to be of beeswax. And so oftentimes you'll see some that are 51% or higher. These are considered acceptable as they are majority beeswax. Now, when it comes to the Holy Eucharist, you are to fulfill all laws. And I think it's just a great statement. It's kind of like, you know what, in case you need a little reminding, follow all the laws, so not just the ones found here. The Code of Canon Law is another source. We talked about another instruction, Redemptionis Sacramentorum, that deals directly with the Holy Eucharist. And so all those laws in there need to be followed. Images, yes, the church says. But usually in the holy space in the church, you would only have one image of a single saint. You wouldn't have a lot of duplication. And they say there's exceptions. And one that I've seen, at least, and I don't know if they've received proper exception, but it's at least something that's been done, is the life of the saint, that you can see these different scenes of the life of the saint. But generally, you'd only have one presentation of that saint. 319, because of Christ, we have the bread and the wine with water. So this is just given to us. This is the Eucharist. This is what we have because that's what Christ did. We have the wheat, which is recently made, unleavened. Rules. Expedient. Once again, we see this word come back up and up and up again. Doesn't mean that it's preferable to it. It just says that you're free to have this option. It is open to you to have this option, that the host be broken into, or the bread, the host be broken into smaller pieces and handed out. But, small hosts aren't excluded, especially if you have a large number, if your community is large, if there are other reasons for not doing that. The wine must be fruit of grapevine. No other kinds, no other fruits, no other anything else. Grapes. This is what it's from. That's the only kind of wine we can have. No strawberry wine, no, gooseberry wine, no, none of this. Grapevine, grapes, wine from grapes. Must be natural, unadulterated, and without extraneous substances. So we got into this discussion with one of my priest friends, and I told him, I said, you can't you can't use wines that have added sulfates in it. And he said, well, of course you can. I said, no, you can't have that because those sulfates are added. Now, some wines have sulfates naturally within them. They're a byproduct of the process, but you can't have any that have been added to it, this extraneous substances. So when we're buying wine, we have to be very careful what kind of wine we're using. Most wines in churches, this isn't a problem because they say on the label there, certified by canon law, by the Bishops' Conference. We have the permission to do this. You can trust that this wine fits all the regulations because it touches on validity. If you don't have, if you used, some kind of other wine, something that wasn't made of grapes, something that wasn't natural, something that was adulterated or had all this extraneous substances in it, it wouldn't be valid. The Mass wouldn't be valid. The Eucharist wouldn't be valid. So this becomes a problem. Now, say the wine and the bread should not turn into vinegar or a brick. So you got to make sure that these things are not going bad for the use. They should be vigilant. That these things are kept fresh and well. So this is an interesting circumstance, and I'm just kind of wondering how it happens or when it happens. But I guess if a priest is not paying close attention to the Mass and he only pours wine into the chalice and doesn't pour any, pours water but no wine, and he goes through the whole consecration, and then he gets to the point of receiving communion, he takes a sip, and it's just water, then he must in that moment stop what he's doing at the Mass. He must go back to the chalice, pour in the wine, pour in the little bit of water, and then he must consecrate the wine right there. He doesn't have to do the rest of the Eucharistic prayer, but he must do the consecration of the wine right there and receive it for the Mass. It's kind of an interesting little side thing that I hadn't even really thought of. 325. So they mentioned that, as we're decorating space, as we have this, and as we make these kind of exceptions to things, there should be, reference to the culture, provided that it is sacred. So it's not just because we can say, oh, well, it's cultural for my group or this group or that group, so we can do whatever. No, it still must have this kind of sense of the sacred, and not just in an abstract way, but in a really certain way that most everyone is going to recognize from that culture. This is sacred. This is not common. This is not vulgar. This is not something offensive, but it's sacred. So then, as beautiful line there, noble simplicity is kind of the rule of things. It's the best companion for genuine art. So as we talk about more furnishings, it talks about noble, not artsy, durable, and for the sacred use. This come up over and over and over again. Sacred vessels, especially, it mentions the chalice and the paten. These things are to be made out, all the furnishings, especially sacred vessels, should be made out of precious metal. If they're not, then they should at least be gilded. But this is kind of, especially the cup on the chalice, if the interior is not precious, then it must be gilded. 329, in the U.S., we have some exceptions here. Precious, sure. For sacred use, yes. Not easily broken or deteriorated. We can use other kind of things. We can use woods if they are precious, if they maintain these things. That's for anything holding a host. One of the things that happened, an abuse that happened years ago was that they had glass or crystal, ciboria, crystal chalices, and again, not easily broken. Yeah, or they would sometimes even, in an awful turn of things, they would have clay chalices, clay deals. These can be easily broken, not for the use. As for the precious blood, you have to use a non-absorbent cup. The base can be solid and of any worthy material, but the cup itself has to be absolutely non-absorbent. Again, gilded if it's not of a precious metal. Patens may be used. So it's speaking of kind of a flat disc-like vessel, as opposed to the ciborium that kind of has those walls raised up, kind of a container of sorts. But the paten can be used if you can fit all the hosts on it in a dignified way, not lose them, not drop the hosts. Style. They talk about the style of the furnishing. Says yes, you can have some regionality. You should have this kind of what is usual to you, but clearly distinguishable from those intended for everyday use. So whenever they're designing the sacred vessels, if they want to put in some kind of local flares, that's fine, but it can't just be common. And I don't have a real good example of this, except for maybe a gilded Joe's cup. We can't use that in Oklahoma, right? It has to be different from those of everyday use. 333, the blessings are done according to the rites for these vessels, and the sagrarium is good and laudable. 335, different vestments for different offices, or that's just a word in the church that we use. They can also mean ministries. So there's different ones according to how they differently serve, and they're blessed accordingly. 336, ordained or instituted, wear an alb, a cincture, and an amice if the amice doesn't cover the collar. But an alb does not serve as a surplice does not serve as an alb. They're not equal. So a priest can't just say, okay, well, I wear my surplice, and so it serves as an alb. No, not permitted by the church. 337. Pre-celebrant wears a chasuble unless otherwise noted, or in all cases he wears it unless it's noted. A deacon wears a dalmatic unless necessity or a lesser solemnity. If you were having just a daily mass, you might not have the deacon wear a dalmatic for that. In the U.S., acolytes, servers, lectors, and other ministers may wear an alb or vestiture or an appropriate dignified clothing. I think most of them here in the U.S., in this area, will just wear, most of the lectors and the other ministers will just wear dignified clothing, appropriate dignified clothing for what they're doing. All right, so 340, the priest wears a stole, and he wears it around the neck, and it hangs down to the front, either crossed or hanging straight down. The deacon wears his, starting at the left shoulder and going down to the right, and he wears it across diagonally. Cope is worn by the priest in processions and other literature and other sacred actions, for instance, baptisms, if outside of Mass, and they're just supposed to follow the rubrics. So just, do the red, say the black. The design. So the design of the vestments is decided by the Conference of Bishops. They propose it to the Apostolic See. Now, just to bring this up, the Apostolic See means Rome, the dicasteries of Rome. So this would probably go to the Congregation for Divine Worship, and they would get the chance to approve the proposal. For instance, one of these things that happens is that in Africa, because it's so hot in sub-Saharan Africa, I guess Saharan Africa is also hot, that the seminarians down there, instead of wearing black cassocks, they will wear white cassocks. So they look like the Pope down there. And I was this close to getting one when I was in Tanzania. But I couldn't wear them back in the U.S. So 343, fabrics. Fabrics should be keeping with the dignity of the sacred action and the person wearing them. So there shouldn't be spandex. There should not be spandex vestments for all that is good and holy. 344, beauty, not as much as beauty instead of not as much from excess ornamentation. So it should be, the beauty should be from material and design. It shouldn't just be from a whole bunch of stuff that we've put together on it. So there should be a noble simplicity again. Color is for the celebration and not for the preference. It's not like, what am I going to wear today as a priest? I think I'll wear a turquoise. No. we choose based on the color of the season or the feast. Now, here we're going to try to run through kind of quickly because it can get really bogged down in a lot of these things. So white is for Easter or Christmas. For the Lord's celebrations other than his Passion, the Blessed Virgin Mary, angels, saints, all saints, the Nativity of John the Baptist, the Feast of John the Evangelist, the Chair of Peter, and the Conversion of Paul. Red is used for Palm Sunday, for Good Friday, Pentecost, the Passion, and the Feast of the Apostles and Evangelists, and of the Martyrs. So for green, it's just ordinary time. Purple is during Advent and Lent, or for any of the offices of the dead. Black and white, at least white in the U.S., is used for funerals. Rose for Gaudete and Laetare Sundays. Solemnity or solemn days, you can wear more precious, even if it's not the same color. So, for instance, it goes on to say that in the U.S., we can wear gold and silver. So, for instance, I might wear a gold vestment. In fact, I have a gold vestment for marriages, matrimony. And so because of that, I might wear it for that because I'm permitted to. Now, the question is blue. In the United States, we're not permitted to wear blue vestments. It's not one of the options. Sometimes in other countries, they wear it for the Blessed Virgin Mary. 347, ritual masses have colors. Various needs, just the color of the day, unless it happens to be a penitential one in which you'd wear purple. Votive masses, you can choose either the one of the day, or if there's one that seems similar for it, you can choose the color for that. 348, other furnishings should be worthy and suited to its purpose. Liturgical books, meaning the Missal and the Evangeliary, must be truly worthy, dignified, and beautiful. So again, this importance on these things. Furthermore, the altar and the Eucharist should likewise always have these things. All of these things surrounding the altar and the Eucharist should also be even more so truly worthy, dignified in beauty. Simple, noble simplicity with elegance. So 352 talks about wider options as we talk about how to choose things for masses, different texts, different options. And it says, first you choose the options based on the needs of the people, not the needs of the priest, not the options of the priest, not the preference of the priest. You choose it on the needs of the people. Then you think about their spiritual preparation. How does choosing this Mass or this celebration help to spiritually prepare my people? And then the third one is cultural. So if there are some cultural aspects about it, and we'll get into that in just a minute. These options are for the choices of text, and there is no improv, no improvisation in this. 353, solemnities. The priest must follow the calendar where he is. The example of this might be that if a Benedictine is celebrating there's a lot of Benedictine feasts on their calendar, but if he goes to a place and there's a local solemnity, then he must celebrate that one. It trumps his own calendar. Otherwise, if there's a congregation, you just choose what they follow. If you're not with a congregation, then you might choose your own calendar. Again, like the example I gave of the Benedictines, you're not with a community, you're not with a congregation, you can celebrate your own calendar. Optional memorials, December the 17th through the 24th, and the octave of Christmas, the 8 days after Christmas, including Christmas, the weekdays of Lent. You do the Mass of the day, but the collect may come from the memorial, except on Ash Wednesday and Holy Weeks. Okay, let me explain. Optional memorials are when there are saints that you don't have to celebrate their memorial, but they're optional. So if you want to, if it's deemed good for the people, again, going back there to the wide options, you think about the needs, you think about the spiritual preparation. Is this a really good saint to bring in? Or is it cultural? Do these people have a strong attachment to this particular saint? For instance, St. George. So if they do, well, I think St. George is actually obligatory memorial. But anyways, you find a saint that's not obligatory. And if you have this optional memorial, you say, okay, well, what if it's during the 17th to the 24th? Rare to happen. Or it's during the octave of Christmas, also rare to happen. During the days of Lent, more frequent to happen. Then you would just do the regular Mass of the day, but the collect, that first prayer, you take it from the memorial. Except on Ash Wednesday and Holy Week. You have to take all of the prayers as they are. Even if there's an optional memorial, you just can't celebrate it then. Weekdays of Easter, you can fully celebrate the saint. Says go for it. Advent weekdays and weekdays of Christmas from January 2nd onward to the end of the Christmas season. Weekdays of Easter, then you just do the Mass of the day or the Saint Memorial or any saint that is in the Roman Martyrology. So any saint that is on that day, you can offer that. Moving on, continued. So weekdays in ordinary time, you just do the Mass of the day or the optional memorial or any saint of that day in the Roman Martyrology. You can also do votive Mass for various reasons or a votive Mass. However, it does give a warning. It says, you shouldn't be interrupting the readings too much because there is kind of a continuance of readings. And so when you start interrupting that with too many optional memorials, then you don't see that kind of what's happening. When people are going to daily Mass every day, they're not seeing that rest of the story, that continuance. And as such, you shouldn't have very many Masses of the dead. The priest can offer Masses for the dead on its anniversaries. We'll get to that in just a minute. But there really shouldn't be too many of those because, again, we shouldn't be interrupting the readings. If there is proper devotion, then the priest should offer it. Meaning that if there's a great devotion to this saint, then yes, offer it. If between the general calendar and the diocesan or religious calendar, then you choose, again, when it's on this weekday, you choose the latter. You choose the diocesan, the local, the most local to you, if all things are equal. As long as there's not a higher feast on the general calendar than on the diocesan. You follow the norms for the text. 357. Sundays and solemnities. You choose you have the three readings, and they're normally, it's a prophet, apostle, and gospel. And again, they are it shows the continuity of salvation. Easter, however, is normally in the Easter season. We have the Old Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Gospel leading up to Pentecost. Feast on a feast day, instead of a solemnity or Sunday, you normally just have 2 readings, unless it's been raised to a solemnity, and then there's 3 readings, and you pick the 3rd reading or the second reading, I guess, in that case, from the Commons, which there are these common sections that you can pick from. Enough said. Memorials, unless given, you take the weekdays readings, and for pastoral reasons, you can make your choice as to whether or not to do those or not. Lectionary for weekdays. So we have the lectionary for weekdays. If interrupted, then you can also, there's an option to bring back that continuous reading. So you might say, we've been following this along closely. Maybe we've been doing a Bible study on it. I really want the people to engage with this. Yesterday we had to be interrupted by a feast with special readings. So we're going to instead add those readings back on. Or if it's an optional memorial, then I can prefer those readings. And also if there's special groups, there's allowances for that. Ritual masses. Ritual masses for sacraments or sacramentals, meaning if we're having a wedding, then that's a sacramental ritual mass, and it has its own readings and everything. Or if there's certain needs in help to help in understanding the mysteries, these things can be provided. Longer or shorter versions. The pastoral rule. If it's good for the people to hear the longer one, if there's reason for them to hear the longer one, the longer one. If there's reasons for them not to hear the longer one, or it's expedient, then to also do the shorter version. 361. Choice of text based on the audience ability, repetitiveness, difficulties. So abilities is, is it for school children? When we have the Catholic schools, is it for the school children? Can they perceive this? Can they receive this? Is there something that's going to be edifying for them in this? Is it up to their ability level? Repetitiveness. Is it going to come up on Sunday again? Do I want them to, hear this other reading instead, to prepare them for what they're going to hear on Sunday? Difficulties. If there's other difficulties that exclude for some reason that particular reading. But no reading should be permanently excluded. The prime example of this is where Paul says to, he's speaking and he's saying to the women, he's speaking directly, and he says, "Women, be subordinate to your husbands." And they say, "What?" They say, this is, if you're in an area where especially people are not very receptive to listening to what St. Paul's really saying, but yet they just get offended about a bunch of things, then you might say that's a difficulty. We need to choose another reading. But again, none of them should be permanently excluded. So at least at some point they should be hearing about what Paul's really after there. And by the way, it's a beautiful, beautiful passage. Paul's not being misogynistic at all. The Ordo must be followed. The Ordo is a little book that I wish I had mine here right now, but it's a little book that kind of tells us all the things that we're supposed to do for Mass. It's our cheat sheet. The orations or the prayers. For memorials, it's the collect, and the rest are taken from the common or from the weekday. Now, if it's ordinary time, you use the previous Sunday or any prayer. You can use any of the Sundays. It's really an interesting thing. I didn't know about this. I've always used the previous Sunday, but it says you can use any of the Sundays for variety, that variety of richness, or you can use a prayer from various needs. There are many prefaces that prayer right before the Eucharistic prayer as you're praying over these gifts, and it says this is the for the richness. And so there's all these different options, and so they should be used, shouldn't be fixated. Choice of Eucharistic prayer. So Eucharistic Prayer 1 can be used always, anywhere. It's especially when there are special parts mentioned. So if on Christmas, for instance, there's a special change in the Eucharistic Prayer 1, so it really ought to be used then. But also when the saints or apostles are mentioned in the litany that's in there, it should be used. And then every Sunday is when it's preferentially used. Eucharistic Part Two is on weekdays or or on special occasions, especially if there's something special about it. It has its own preface, but it also has the option to use other prefaces. For the dead, if the Mass is being offered for the dead, there is a special inclusion in there that is part of the prayer that is only used when the dead are mentioned. Eucharistic Prayer 3 is used on Sundays, primarily in feasts, especially when the saints are mentioned, because there's a place in there where you input the name of the saint of the day. It can use any of the prefaces, and when it has Mass of the Dead, there's an addition there. Eucharistic Prayer 4 is it only has a special preference. It has its own special one, and it can't be used with any others. And so when there's a preface that must be used, or any of the Sundays, it can't be used there. Or Sundays in ordinary time. Sundays outside of ordinary time must use the prefaces, special prefaces, so they can't be used then. The preface is fixed, so there's no other changes to that. No substitutions for chants. So, for instance, it mentions the Agnus Dei. So it's that you can't change the Agnus Dei for the Kyrie. Or you can't, move and mix around, or you can't say, hey, I created a new chant. Instead of Agnus Dei, we're going to say, O Holy One of God. So, again, we can't change these things. 367 just gives references to those things, so referring back to it. There's various formularies for different events in life. This is kind of the beauty of the church, that it gives us these special masses throughout life that hit on these different points. One of them is harvest season. And so there's beautiful prayers for that. There's beautiful prayers for the planting season. So all of these give kind of this special motion through life, and various other circumstances as well. However, we should use these votive masses. We should use these optional choices in moderation, and really kind of for necessity, for the needs of the community. All various circumstances, unless noted, use the weekday readings and the regular chants. So the various masses that can be offered are the ritual masses, the masses for various needs, the masses for various circumstances, and the votive masses. Ritual masses are, again, going back, we talked about this a little bit about sacraments and sacramentals. It is prohibited on Sundays of Advent, Lent, and Easter. Solemnities, the octave of Easter, the 8 days after Easter, including Easter, All Souls Day, Ash Wednesday, and Holy Week. You cannot have these on those days. So, again, we got to be careful what we're looking at when we're doing these things. There's various needs or circumstances. Those masses have set times, or they're as needed. And the bishop may designate times for his own diocese. In the U.S., maybe notably, we think of this one as January 22nd, when we offer up a penitential mass for the sin of abortion and the great evil that it is. So this has been put forth by the U.S. Conference of Bishops. It's to be celebrated in every diocese and every church. 374, with the bishop's permission, an appropriate mass may be celebrated on any day except a solemnity, Sundays of Advent, Lent, and Easter, the octave of Easter, the All Souls Day, the Ash Wednesday, and Holy Week. Gotta get all my letters together. 375, votive masses can be offered even if there's an offered even if there's an optional memorial on that day. So if there's an optional memorial, you can say, well, okay, but a votive mass is more important here. And so any weekday in ordinary time, you can offer a votive mass, just not from the lives of Jesus and Mary. So if it has something to do with their lives, you can't. But it has to do something with their character, then it can be. On obligatory memorials, weekdays of Advent, Christmas from January 2nd onward, Easter after the octave, you have a forbidden ritual masses. So I put the number, it's all the other masses are forbidden except ritual masses. So you can't have masses for various needs, masses for various circumstances, or votive masses. But there are exceptions to that. Weekdays of ordinary time, permitted any mass or prayers but not from the ritual. So you have to be careful about, um, again, this is why we have order, those little cheat sheets to keep this all straight for us. We don't calculate it every single day. Blessed Virgin Mary is often normally offered the votive Mass on Saturday, as it is traditionally the day that we celebrate her, and especially as her discipleship, her motherhood, and her great intercession with her Son. Masses for the dead can be offered or are offered for petition for those souls in purgatory. The first amongst these Masses for the dead is the funeral. It can be any day except the Holy Day of Obligation, Holy Thursday, the Triduum, those 3 days of Holy Week that are the most sacred, Sundays of Advent, Lent, or Easter. Masses of the Dead. I'm trying to remember all my acronyms. Mass of the Dead. You can offer one at the first news of the death. You can offer it at the final burial, meaning in the sense where they're buried, where you're taking the body to bury it, and on the first anniversary. These masses can be offered during the octave of Christmas, anytime there's an obligatory memorial, weekdays, except when it's Ash Wednesday or Holy Week. Funeral masses, homily, yes. Eulogy, never. So this is something that I think is still going on. This kind of abuse is still going on. And what it does is really modeling things after Protestants. Protestants have come up with this eulogizing, and it's seen in a lot of movies. It seems really fancy, but this is why we have wakes in the church with the rosary the night before, is to give people for a chance for the eulogy. But once it comes to a funeral mass, that's not acceptable. Again, we learned that just recently that at the AMBO, it is really only dignified for one of the ministers of the word to go to. So to have just somebody get up there and start rambling on, and oftentimes it's a really kind of awkward situation for them to be in and for everyone else to be in as well. Rarely have I heard it done excellently. And so with that, taking that pressure off, they're just supposed to enter in spiritually to the Mass, and all of the things are there to help them. And if done properly, it is extremely beautiful, and the eulogy would be seemingly out of place. 383. The faithful, especially for the family, are encouraged to receive Holy Communion if they are in a good state to receive it. But we got to be careful, because there are, of course, a lot of people who are fallen away Catholics. They're not permitted to receive the Eucharist if they're in this state of mortal sin. If they're in a state of manifest mortal sin, scandalous mortal sin, then the priest must deny them the Eucharist. So it gets kind of tricky with all of that. But this idea that they should receive Holy Communion is because there Jesus Christ can console them from within. His very presence, body, blood, soul, and divinity, can when they receive the host, they can receive Jesus to nourish their heart, to tend to their heart. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful little theological gem that's been placed in this instruction. Next one, if there's a burial, then you omit the concluding rites, and you just go straight into the rite of farewell. That's if the body is present. The choices of parts are the priests. So again, sometimes people say, "Oh, Father, we've already picked out everything." Okay, well, careful, right? So it's this really kind of Burger King kind of mentality, my way, right away. No, so the church, and especially the priest, is trying to give really great pastoral considerations, and especially when you are talking about non-Catholics or lapsed Catholics, the priest is oftentimes more sensitive to all of these things, because the family might just breeze over them, and they might not be thinking about some of these other things. And the priest really does have a lot of great sensitiveness, tenderness, compassion in these moments, and can really do a lot of great good by making proper choices. Also, to know that no non-hymnal music, non-approved music is not permitted at the funerals, just as it isn't in any of the other masses. There's a great care for the full and active and fruitful participation, more adaptations to follow. So we're kind of into this final part where it's talking about all of these things, saying, again, this is this great goal, and so there's a great wideness of the church trying to embrace people to be in this full, active, and fruitful participation. But it belongs to the bishop to direct and watch over all of these things. He's the head liturgist for his diocese. All right. The Conference of Bishops is to prepare and approve a missal with the recognition of the Holy See, the Apostolic See, in Latin or the vernacular in its entirety. So, again, if it's going to be a Latin missal, which is, again, still the what do we call that? The inheritance of the church, the great joy, the presence of the church we have in Latin. But again, because people aren't able to do that, we've talked about the adaptations that people are again, it's for their needs and their spiritual good that we should offer the masses, and we shouldn't be making choices just on preferences of the pastor or the priest. So it's for their good, for their enrichment, and as well to fall in line. When we must, we must. When we ought, we ought. And when we can, we have to evaluate those things. So 390, gestures, postures, gestures of venerating the altar, the evangelary, the text of chants at the entrance, gifts, and communion, the readings in specific circumstances, the sign of peace, receiving of communion, materials for the altar, furnishings, vestments, vessels, the color, the form, the fabric. These are all decisions that belong to the Conference of Bishops to make. And so we saw some of those things as we went through here. The Conference of Bishops is to translate the biblical text, and the language is to be easily grasped by the people, but maintaining the characteristic of biblical books. So this is why we don't just take any translation, but it needs to have this kind of biblical nature about it. The Conference of Bishops is to translate the prayers and the other parts of the Mass faithfully into the Latin, or faithful to the Latin, meaning that they should not sit there and try to say, well, that sounds funny. But no, we should. These things are really well considered. They aren't just haphazard, and somebody didn't just sit down and make them up. They belong to the patrimony, the church's gift to each and every one of us, and we are entrusted to be kind of guardians to protect that and to ensure that for the next generation. There will always be things that have to be explained. And in regions, it's best if it's the same in the region, the same translation if possible. So there shouldn't be a Texas version of the Missal and a New York version of the Missal, and no, we should have the same one if possible. The Council of Bishops, or the Conference of Bishops, must approve all musical settings before their use. So this is like the Kyrie or the Agnus Dei or the Sanctus. If you have these different musical settings, they need to be approved by the Conference of Bishops before use so that they might be dignified of the Mass. Again, it goes back to the organ as primary, but others may be used. They're with history. They're provided. They are with the history. With the history means that they have been used. So it's not that we just kind of introduce new things and say, oh yeah, well we can use these now. No, there should be kind of again a tradition of this usage, and not just kind of a novelty of use. Perfect example of this is the tambourine. Tambourine just kind of thrown into the mix and said, hey, we're going to use this now because it's in popular music and we should use it. And I say, no, it's not really dignified of the Mass. It's dignified of a dance club in the 60s and 70s maybe, but it's not of the Mass. And again, provided they're truly apt for the sacred use. So, for instance, probably not a bass guitar, in the sense that this really isn't bringing us closer into sacred use. It's bringing things out into a more secular use. It's the inverse of what's supposed to happen. Each diocese has its own calendar. The Conference of Bishops should make a national one, and Sundays should be primordial. I mean, they should be the primary and the focus. We really shouldn't have things trumping Sundays. Sundays are very important. There shouldn't be a whole lot of stepping on Sunday's toes. And then Vatican II should be highly encouraged to be used. All of the things that they brought forth. Rogation and Ember days should also be indicated. These are days of extra fasting and penance. Special celebrations should be found in the appendix. For example, the 4th of July. If recently received the faith, if an area has recently received the faith, the Conference of Bishops may propose adaptations in detail to be approved by the Apostolic See, and there ought to be a period of experimentation and then kind of an evaluation of how did that go. In the United States, we don't have that. So it's not really a big issue for us, and really pretty much most of the parts of the world, this is becoming a very rare occasion. Only maybe in countries where there are not Catholic populations, haven't been for hundreds of years, maybe like the Middle East, some countries that have been Islamically ran for centuries, maybe in that you might find some still adaptation chances. Special care to helping the clergy and the faithful learn these things. So if there are these adaptations, these changes, there really needs to be an emphasis for them to learn these things. The particular church must be in accordance with the universal church. So the church here in the United States, the church here in this diocese, needs to be in accordance with the universal church. So even though there's these adaptations that can be proposed, they always need to bring us back. They should never be separating, but they should bring us back to the universal church. So even if there are some exceptions that were granted to the U.S., they're really to bring us back closer into the universal church. They're serving as bridges to bring us that way, not to separate us further. This is done in doctrine and sacramental signs, and even in usages. The Roman Rite is noble and precious. It speaks beautifully of this. Very nice words. There's no innovation unless required for benefit. And then enculturation takes time. So there's not the creating of new rites. There's not going to be like an American rite, as there is a Roman Rite. But we do see adaptations for certain needs. But they need to be real, authentic needs. The Roman Missal is an instrument and an outstanding sign of the integrity and unity of the Roman Rite. So again, we follow these things. Why? Because we're Roman Rite. This is where we are. This is what the church has given us. We have identity in the church, and the way that we celebrate our Catholic faith is through the Roman Rite. It's beautiful, should be respected. Okay, that brings us to the end of this part, the end of this section. I think my face was kind of half cut off there during the filming this. I'm sorry about that. Next video will just kind of be a recap. It won't be a long video, but there will be some things that maybe weren't covered in here in the GIRM that may be just a little more fleshing out. And then, some opinions. So if you guys have questions, if you've made it through this whole thing and you say, you know what, I still have a question about what do we do with this, or has the church made any kind of statement on that? If you guys will email those to me at pastor plus GIRM, GIRM, at panhandlecatholic.org, then I will get to those and prepare those for the next video, which will come out a week from now. So until then, thank you all, and God with you.